welcome to Catalyst. Today's show is a cooperative effort between RETN and The Radiator, 105.9 FM in Burlington. I'm Shelagh Shapiro, and I have a show on the Radiator called Write the Book, in which I interview authors. Today I have the great pleasure of speaking with Vermont author Tim Brookes. Tim is the director of the professional writing program at Champlain College in Burlington. He's also the founder and editor-in-chief of the Champlain College Publishing Initiative. He's a longtime essayist for National Public Radio and an award-winning journalist, and he has just published his 14th book titled First Time Author with Champlain Books, which is a division of Barnes McQueen Publishing Resources. Tim's publishing experience includes work with major New York publishing houses, small literary presses, and niche professional publishers, and he's the president of the Endangered Alphabets Project and president of Percentage Possibility Publications. And his bio tells us that he also makes a nice cup of tea, which is that's a fun fact. So welcome, Tim. I'm so happy to talk to you today.
Thanks, I'm glad to be here.
I really enjoyed First Time Author, partly because it's very relevant for me right now, but also just because I think it'll be so helpful to people who are trying to write their first books. So I thought I would start by asking you a question about something you talk about early in the book, which is the way that our emotions can sometimes make us give up when we're trying to start a project. So I wonder if you can talk about that, about fear and self-sabotage, and we'll go from there.
Sure. So the book started, or the idea for the book started, I'm going to say 4 or 5 years ago, when I had started the Champlain College Publishing Initiative, and we had an idea for a book that I wanted to do that would be very useful to Champlain students. There wasn't a book like it. I said, good, we'll write our own, we'll publish our own. And I pulled together 3 really good candidates to collaborate on writing it. One was a student who was just graduating from the professional writing program, very bright student, very dedicated. One was somebody who works at Champlain in the careers office, who's an experienced journalist. And one was somebody who's worked for years in journalism as an editor and as a writer, who's worked as a producer, a marketing writer, everything. Mm-hmm. And so I thought this team's bound to be able to pull this together. And they ran into all kinds of sort of difficulties that they were sort of they weren't expecting. And eventually the whole thing ground to a halt, and it was very hard to see why. And what I realized was that all of them had experience writing short forms of prose or poetry, nonfiction, fiction, but short forms. And that the act of writing a book is not just like writing several short things and then putting them together. Mm-hmm. It's actually a sort of a cumulative act. And at every stage, the challenges multiply. And it was so funny because I hadn't, even though at that time I had written maybe 8 books, I had never thought about that. I thought, if I have difficulty writing a book, that's just me, whatever.
Right.
And at this point I started thinking, what is it about the act of writing a book that makes it quantitatively and qualitatively different from writing something shorter? And I realized that, especially if it's your first book, the only way you learn how to write a book is by writing a book, usually. And so therefore, every challenge you encounter is something new. Mm-hmm. And it's very easy to encounter any of these challenges, and obviously I talk about these in the book, and to feel, I don't know how to get past this, I don't know what I'm doing, I'm not a writer, I'm not an author. And essentially to sort of crash your own plane at that point. And so I talk about the book as being a minefield map. This is where the mines are, these are where the things could go wrong. So it's not specifically about writing a novel or a nonfiction book, it's more about writing anything that requires that level of endurance, that level of complexity, that number of different new challenges. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Now, one thing that you said that I found really interesting was that sometimes an attack of self-doubt is a useful warning.
Yes.
So what do you mean by that?
So I tell this story in the book where both for my first and second books, pretty early on, I found myself thinking, I'm not the person to write this book. I shouldn't be writing this book. In the first case, which was my asthma book, I thought, oh, you know, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a medical researcher, I don't know. There will be thousands of people looking over my shoulder saying, you don't know this, you don't understand this. And with the second book, which is a book about hospice, I imagined a battlefield journalist saying, you know, how many people have you seen die? I've seen 1,000 people die, you know, etc. And so on both occasions, I sort of nearly stopped myself and nearly sort of gave up. And then what I realized, and this is what your question really is talking about, is that the fact is, if we allow ourselves to go into a project like that, and you really don't know what you're talking about, and you're just kind of writing off the top of your head, somebody is going to come along and say, you don't know what you're talking about. And so this is actually, so to speak, a red flag rather than a landmine. It's just something that says, you know what? You want to be sure you've got this right. You want to be sure you know what you're talking about. It's actually, you can turn it around and say, this is my unconscious or whatever, making sure that I keep up to a necessary standard. And as such, it's a really valuable voice to have in your head, as long as you don't misinterpret it and say, oh, I'm not the right person, I'm going to give up.
Right. Especially in this day with Amazon reviews, where everybody's going to attack anything that you get wrong, right?
I suppose so, yeah.
So I think that you sort of went from that thought into the fact that you tend to start your projects with research. And you suggest other people do the same because it's a really good way to start to figure out what you want to say. So talk a little bit about that, and also why, as you state in the book, fiction writers have just as much responsibility to do research as nonfiction writers. I thought that was great.
Yeah, if I see another short story or 800-page novel by a fantasy fiction writer who's talking about these people battling with these people, and you've got lasers and swords, a lightsaber, you've got a laser in your hand, just shoot him with the laser. You know, and so you've got people writing about battles who've never seen a battle, who have no idea what that's all about. So, and I have a friend who has got a very nice contract to do a trilogy of historical novels, and he almost certainly spent way more time researching than he spent writing. Mm-hmm. So either way, fiction or non-fiction, you probably want to know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing about the research phase for me is that research can really mean several different things. So for many of my books, research has been a combination of, reading newspaper articles, reading technical stuff online, interviewing people, but a lot of it is also involved going places where you're sort of inflicting the research on yourself. And so, for example, my hitchhiking book, you can't do that unless you go hitchhiking. You've got to actually do that. And 30% chance of enlightenment, the only way you can understand the monsoon in India is by being in the monsoon in India.
Right. The interesting thing about that book is that it sprang out of research that you were doing for actually another project.
For National Geographic,
yeah,
that's right.
And then that ended up changing and you wrote this.
Yeah. So the other point I would make is that research certainly sounds really dry and really dull. And frankly, when I started writing my first book, my asthma book, I was really in no shape to enjoy researching at all because I had hated doing that as an undergraduate, and I'd done as little as possible of the whole thing. But what happened, and I sort of fell into this by accident, is that whenever I'm starting work on a book project, I start keeping a writer's journal on the subject of that book. So not only will I be making notes on whatever it is that I'm reading or whoever it is that I'm interviewing, but I'll also then write down thoughts, ideas, suggestions. So that becomes a really interesting combination of two things. The raw material, which you've sort of picked out of here and there, and then the process of kind of turning that over in your mind and saying, well, if that's true, how about so-and-so? And does this connect with that over there? And it starts provoking more questions. And so research is not just a cumulative process where you gather stuff. It's a process where you have to allow yourself to be changed by the experience of taking material in.
Mm-hmm.
And in that sense, creative nonfiction is ideal for this because you dive into your subject, and the act of being changed by your subject is one of the things that you're really writing about.
Okay. Now, what did you have to research to write this book?
So basically, to write first-time author, I had to write all the previous books. I mean, everything I had done before was research. But the other thing is that I've worked with a lot of people who themselves are first-time authors.
Sure.
And I think the first of those was actually Joe Citro.
Oh, wow.
Way back in 1983.
Oh, okay.
He came to me, he had his manuscript of what was going to become his first book, and so I helped him work on that.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, it's really important to see all of the various pitfalls and mines that other people have, fallen into or exploded on the way. And that was my research in a sense. So I guess I had been researching that really for 30 years.
Yeah, okay, that qualifies.
Just about.
You're
yeah,
off the
yeah.
hook. In the book, in First Time Author, you say an outline can be a cage or can become a cage. That was really interesting to me because I don't tend to outline my fiction as I go because of that. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So when I'm talking to somebody who's writing a book for the first time, that person quite often has a set of areas of interest and expertise which don't include writing. So the person may be, I don't know, a diplomat or an engineer or a yoga teacher or whatever. And it may well be that their last experience of trying to organize their thoughts in writing was back in high school or maybe in college, where they did an outline before they did an essay, or at least they were told to do an outline before they did an essay. And that may have worked under those circumstances, but for a book, and this goes back to what I was saying about the research should change you, for a book, when you accumulate that much material, and that's true whether it's fiction or non-fiction, your way of understanding your subject is going to change. And it's going to become more and more developed and richer and more nuanced and more complicated. So therefore, one of the things that has to happen is that you have to allow for that process of change and growth. If at the very beginning you say, okay, so here's my outline, ding, 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 and that's all you allow yourself to consider, then you may well either get into the problem where you've come across this whole nest of new material. This happens in fiction all the time, as you know. You suddenly go, oh, and this character suddenly starts growing, and then they have a friend who comes in here, and all this kind of stuff. And you sort of go, oh, but this doesn't fit my outline, so therefore I don't know how to write this book. Or this doesn't fit my outline, so I need to cut all this good material out. It can become a cage.
Yeah.
If, on the other hand, and I talk about this quite a lot, you allow yourself to keep returning to that general sense of shape and saying, wow, you know what? This is so important. I've got to include this. Let me have a look at everything I've got now. Do I have to include everything? Are there bits that I can now say, you know what? I was going to include this, but I don't think I'm going to now. And so your sense of shape is crucial because that develops along with your material.
Yes. Okay. I loved the graphic that you put in the group, and I don't have a copy of it. But basically,
Okay.
You were saying you're trying. If you have an outline, or if you have an idea of exactly what the book should look like before you even start, it's sort of like a straight line. You want to go from here to here, and halfway along, you start to veer off in this circle that.
I've got to tell the story behind that.
It's so funny.
So this all actually began at St. Michael's College in 1982 or 1983 or something like that. I was teaching there briefly at the time, and I was struck by the fact that all of my students were so used to doing a 5-paragraph essay with an introduction and all this kind of stuff. I said, no, I don't want the introduction. I don't want the conclusion. I just want the heart of the matter. So I said, what I want you to do is to think of something that happened over the summer, something that was really sort of vivid and dramatic that you remember very, very clearly. And I want you just to find the heart of that, the crucial 2 or 3 minutes. Just write that crucial 2 or 3 minutes. So the whole piece you write should be maybe half a page long. And so one girl, she writes this piece. My alarm clock went off. So straight away I'm going, oh no. And so she's telling the story about how she gets up and she's in a bad mood, and she shouts at her little brother, and her little brother's a brat, and they're supposed to be going out on their sailboat on the Long Island Sound, and they get in the car, and she doesn't get to sit in the way back, her little brother does, so she's mad. This just goes on forever. So they get down to the place where the boat is docked, and they get on the boat, and now things are kind of going pretty well. It's a nice day. So they sail down the Long Island Sound. They pull into a little harbor. Her father and her little brother go ashore in the dinghy. They put their bathing suits on. They lie in the sun. She and her mother, everything is good. So then, suddenly, around the corner comes a Coast Guard cutter. And it's going, everybody get back in your boats, because there's a storm coming.
Okay.
And in fact, they can see there's this single black line all the way across the sky that's coming towards them with terrifying speed. And there's no sign of the father and the brother, and then they appear on the shoreline, and they're waving, come quick, and they're kind of going, yeah, no, come quick, come. So they wait. Anyway, so this goes on. And by now the storm is right overhead, and the wind is just whipping around, and the waves are coming up, and the father turns to the kids and says, get below. Now, at this point, it's really starting to get going, right? But she realizes, I was supposed to write half a page. I've written a page and 3/4 already. Oh no, he'll be mad at me. So she wrote, the next 20 minutes were the most terrifying of my life. Luckily, my father managed to get us back to the harbor. And then she realized she had to say something, because otherwise it'd be an anticlimax. And so she said, but I'll never forget that day, right? And that's when I realized that for many people, writing seems to be a linear process. You start at A, you go to Z, or as you say in this country, Z, right?
Yeah.
But if the subject really engages you, which is what happened to her, ultimately she's really getting into it. Her writing is becoming more interesting, more exciting. She's now realizing, wait a second, I'm getting further and further away from whatever my assignment was. And if she had let herself carry on writing at that point, then the next 20 minutes would have been fantastic, and she would have written about that, and then she could have just thrown away the first 2 pages, and there would have been, right? So when my students, and adults as well, have this experience, they say, oh, well, I was going to write about that, but I thought I'd be going off on a tangent. And what I point out is that if you actually continue that process of getting on a roll with what you're writing, then the thing that the good stuff gets written, and that the tangent is actually the line from A to Z. So your thought about what it should be about is actually the tangent. I still think that diagram is one of the best things I've ever created. I tell my students, you know what, this is worth the price of admission in itself.
It was really a good diagram. I loved it. I want to talk a little bit about something you call glowing fragments.
Yeah.
You mentioned in the book that you love the work of Anne Lamott, Bird by Bird author, but you do differ from her on one point, and that is that she says that you should write terrible first drafts. That's not her adjective, but we can't use it on TV. So she says you write terrible first drafts, and then you can always go back and revise. And you suggest instead writing glowing fragments.
Right.
So talk a little bit about that.
Well, first of all, it's a heck of a lot harder to take a really dull, boring, awful, whatever first draft and revise it than it seems to be. First of all, you're aware that you're reading your own prose and it's really awful. And that's one of those emotional minds. You can say to yourself, I'm just a terrible writer, I'll never do it, just because of what you've written is so bad. Secondly, often it's really bad not because of the individual words that you can change, but because of the whole perspective. The way you're looking at it is all wrong. You've headed into it with some kind of really dull approach, and that's made the whole thing dull. You can't just rewrite that and make it better. You have to start sort of completely afresh in order to get out of that dull approach mentality. So I think there are problems with the just write an awful first draft and keep revising approach. What I call glowing fragments goes along also with what I was saying about research, in the sense that as you're thinking about what you're writing, or as you're reading bits of research you're doing, or as you're talking to people, individual words and phrases occur to you and you kind of go, ooh, that's good. I'm going to put that down. Now, if you think of writing as being something where you sit down, you do the old Jack Nicholson and The Shining thing, where you put the paper in the typewriter, you start at page 1, and you type through, then all of these little words and phrases and things, they seem like a mess. It looks as if you're not writing. You have to write continuous prose. And I say, nonsense. Writing is the act of distilling the most interesting things that you have to say on the subject. And those really interesting things may well be a paragraph here, a sentence there, possibly, a page or two. And as long as you don't let yourself get scared by the prospect of having to organize these, then what it means is that you have got this pile of material, and it's not an awful first draft, it's a brilliant, messy first draft. And then you can start connecting things and putting them together, and all of those bits and pieces that were these glowing fragments are there. And some of them you rewrite, and some of them you develop, and some of you decide they weren't that good after all. But then you've got this really interesting bunch of material, which is interesting to you, and that is as important as anything else. If you're going to write a book, you've probably got to spend a minimum of 2 years doing it. Therefore, at every stage along the way, what you're doing has got to be interesting to you. Otherwise, you won't do it.
Right. And another thing that you said that I loved, which is so true, is the beauty of the golden fragment is the next time that you sit down to write, if you are not feeling as excited as you were when you wrote that thing that came out really well, you can reread that. Maybe even I sometimes will reread it aloud just to get myself back in that space. And then, it's a lot easier to keep going and find the next golden fragment.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And so it's almost as if it has to do with, biorhythms or brainwave patterns or whatever, because when you sit down cold, as you know, to write, what you write is cold. And you have to be prepared to do whatever it takes to warm yourself up or get yourself moving till you get to the point where you recognize, wow, that was actually kind of an interesting thought, or that's actually a pretty good turn of phrase. I am now at, I've reached flying speed. I've stopped taxiing. Now I'm actually, airborne. And yes, and so it means that when you then go back to something that you wrote that you're pleased with, it's as if that in itself gets you airborne. You don't have to kind of trundle.
Right.
Trundling as a writer is it's tedious, it's time consuming, it can be very demoralizing. And many of my students, again, when they say I'm having writer's block, what they really mean is that the stuff that I'm putting down on the page now, I don't really like. That's not writer's block. That's you actually judging accurately that this isn't not very good,
Right. And maybe taking a needed pause while your maybe brain figures out what you haven't yet realized.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. I wanted to talk a little bit about the pros and cons of getting feedback. Either feedback from a writing group, from a single person who you respect and admire, whatever, a mentor. What would you say about that?
Well, first of all, I would have to say, and I'm now going to reveal your book here,
okay.
Right? So one of the things that I really enjoyed in looking at your book, Shape of the Sky, is I looked in the acknowledgements and I saw some familiar names in there.
Oh, good.
And I saw Susan Ritz, for example, who once took a class with me, who's a wonderful person, excellent writer.
Yes.
Angie Palm, Jessica, obviously, Kim McQueen. And then I saw Chris Noel.
Yes.
So for those who don't know, Chris Noel's writing Hazard and the Five Delights, his novel, I think that's just a wonderful, wonderful book. Dave Dillon, you mentioned.
Yeah.
So another myth about writing is you do it alone, right? You go up to the garret or down into the basement, you scrape away the mold, you put the typewriter there, and you prove yourself,
right.
you know, by going it alone and by banging it out and all this kind of stuff. And every single book I've written has really relied to an extent which is basically this, somewhere between there and there, on help from other people. And one of the things I tell my students is that writing the acknowledgements page is one of the great delights of writing a book, because you really get to give that back to people. So there are these two myths about writing. Actually, it's a myth and a half. So one myth is you've got to do it alone, otherwise it doesn't count, you know. The half a myth is you shouldn't tell anybody what you're doing, because otherwise you'll kind of let the air out of the balloon. You won't have the incentive to write it anymore. And that actually can be a bit of an issue. If you go around saying, okay, so I'm writing this novel, and this happens, and this happens, and then this happens, right? Then where's the surprise even to yourself? Again, right. You're your first reader. You know, you've got to be excited and pleased by what you're doing. And if you're sitting down and you've just gabbed to 81 people about this great plot twist you've got, it's become old hat. So there is a degree of that. Having said that, you really want to choose very, very carefully who it is who helps you. And so, for example, I had a student just this morning who said, is it okay if I send you a piece of writing and you can just tear it apart and rip it to pieces? And I said, no, I'm not going to do that. You know, I'm certainly going to give you some constructive suggestions, but the whole idea that it's good for you to be abused. There are not only are there writers groups that believe that, there are writing programs that believe
right.
that.
Well, I mean, I think the original writing program was sort of that model.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if I could track down the people who taught like that, I would, you know, bury them in a shallow grave. You know, there is a notion, there's another notion, which is that only the fittest get through the process of writing a book, and therefore only the fittest books get written. Mm-hmm. And in fact, at the Young Writers Conference on the Champlain College campus about 3 years ago, a novelist came up from Middlebury College, you know, very well thought of guy. And that was his message to the students. Get used to writing terrible writing, get used to rejection, it's good for you. And if you write 6 novels that are rejected and you struggle through all of this pain and suffering, you may become a novelist at the end of all of it. And I thought, how quickly can I get down to stage and kill him? Is there a possibility I can do without anybody seeing me, you know, without me being captured on camera? So you do want to choose your allies judiciously. And in fact, actually, I'd like you to talk about those people I mentioned, for example, and how they helped you in this process as kind of writing allies.
Oh, okay, great. Well, I am in 2 different writing groups, which seems like it's superfluous, but the fact is that when I finished my MFA in writing, I joined a writing group that's in Montpelier, and we meet every 2 weeks, and I love it, and that's the group that Susan Ritz is in. And so a few years ago I thought, well, yeah, but I'm driving so far every 2 weeks, maybe I should investigate if there's anything in Burlington, and I found a writing group that I really like in Burlington. But then I fell in love with both groups, so now I have to stop looking for groups. But they are all very, very fruitful, and we give each other feedback. One of the groups we read aloud, and the other group we share work ahead of time. It's very, very useful to me, but it's not everybody's style, I think.
And equally, different groups of people have different styles.
Yes.
They have a different sense of why they're meeting.
Mm-hmm.
I have actually not joined writers' groups. But I think part of that is that when I first started writing a lot, so I started out as a poet and then a short story writer, and then I was sort of laid off and I had to find income, and I started working as a journalist. And at that point, one of the great things about journalism is that your writing is actually getting a response from the public. You know, if you write something that has mistakes or is dull or is useless in terms of information, you'll find out about it. And so that's kind of like writing for the stage, where you're pretty naked. You're really going to hear back from people. And so pretty early on, I got enough of a sense of what worked and what didn't work from that kind of feedback. What I would not recommend, in fact, is the business of going into your own room or your own basement and just writing, because then you really have no sense of what you do well, what you don't do well. That a degree of feedback is essential.
Right.
The tricky part is if you're writing a novel or, say, an opera, it's such a big thing,
Right.
that you can't say, okay, I'm going to write this, and when it's done, I'm going to see what my readers think of it, because you're writing for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years before you start getting any feedback at all.
Right.
It's actually much easier to start writing shorter forms and then gradually build up to it.
Yeah.
But even then, as I said at the top of the show, there are all kinds of ways in which you can fall down or doubt yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I do get out of a writing group, though, is a deadline. And you can see themes. You can sort of see what people picked up on. If multiple people are saying the same thing, then it's possible that you should double check it. Yeah. So that was it was a pleasure to read First Time Author, and I appreciate your talking with me about it today.
Well, thank you very much for your intelligent attention. That's one of the greatest gifts that a reader can give a writer.
Great.
So, in the second part of our show, as they say in the trade, so I'm going to be talking to you about your novel. And for those of you who don't realize that Shelagh does other things apart from interview writers and editors and publish and stuff. So you've written and published a wide variety of short stories. You have an MFA in creative writing from the Vermont College of Fine Arts, I believe.
Yes, right.
This, which I will hold up so everyone can see it again. So this is your first published novel.
Yes.
So I'm going to ask you a question which really continues from the conversation that we've had before, which is, what went wrong with the others?
Oh, what went wrong with them? I couldn't publish them.
Okay.
No, nothing went wrong with them, actually. I'm really pleased, actually, with 2 of them, and I may well return to them someday. But I think this one, I think that I had had enough time and experience to write something that perhaps met its goals a little better than the other ones, which were still sort of early novels, training novels, learn how to write novels.
Okay, so I'm going to push you on that a little bit.
Okay.
And I'm going to say, think back to your first one, when you were a first-time author, right?
Yes.
If you were talking now to the person who was writing that novel, what advice would you give yourself?
Well, to do more research is a really good idea. That novel had to do with a genealogist, and I really didn't know anything about researching family trees, and I just made it up. So I think that was a failure of that book, and I would definitely tell that person to do more research.
So if I could just interrupt for a second,
Sure.
and then I'll carry on. So not only did that mean that what you said about genealogy was not necessarily accurate or whatever,
Right.
but it also meant that you didn't give yourself the opportunity in learning about genealogy to discover an entire range of richness that you might have done.
Absolutely.
And so it became an area that remained, so to speak, flat or static. What you knew at the beginning was what you knew at the end.
Exactly.
And I tell my students, one of the reasons why I really recommend you don't write fantasy fiction is because you don't learn anything by writing it. You're still the same person at the end. The imaginative fancies you have and the conceits that you have at the end are still the ones that you had at the beginning. If you write a novel where you're actually learning something about the world, you will grow as a person as well as growing as a writer.
Although I would add that you can study the world, research this world, in creating a believable other world.
Sure, absolutely.
But yes.
Yeah. Okay, so if you were looking back at your early self, you would
Yes.
say, right, do some research, right? What other advice would you give to yourself?
Well, I take a long time to write. I'm a very slow writer. I mean, you said 2 years. It's usually much, much more than that for me. And so I would give myself the advice to really build in a regular schedule where I look at it as a job. And I sit down at my desk, whether it's every day or not, but these are the 4 days a week that I'm going to work 3 hours, something like that. Absolutely would tell myself that I had to do that and make sure that I stuck to it.
Talk about that in the context of a home and family life.
Very difficult, right? And actually, when I started writing fiction, I had had a baby, and that's sort of how it all started. I'd always wanted to write. I had this little boy, and so I wrote around his naps, which wasn't always so consistently reliable. But it is very hard. There's a lot going on at home when you have a family, so that's tough.
So, in fact, that becomes another kind of sabotaging element where you say to yourself, I should be working on my book, but the laundry needs to be done.
Yes.
And I
it's
really need
always
to go and
the
pick
laundry,
up.
isn't it?
It's always the laundry. It's always the laundry. And I've got to go and pick up, my child from preschool or daycare or whatever. And that's a more important thing.
Yes.
And so the writing can be shoved into a smaller and smaller and smaller box, which may not totally be a disaster until you start saying to yourself, you know what? Doing that MFA was a waste of time. I should never have even thought of myself as a writer. Because then you're really sabotaging yourself.
Yes. Although, actually, what happened to me was I hit a wall and was like, what do I do? I think I'll get an MFA. And actually, that opened up, for me personally, it opened up a whole world. I wouldn't necessarily say that will happen for everybody, but so it's sort of backwards.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the reason that happened was that I had a lot of near success that then didn't come to pass, which was very debilitating.
Yeah, absolutely.
So.
And one of the things that MFA does is to insist on a schedule. You need to turn in material, so that means you've got to solve that time problem.
Right. Right.
And especially if you're paying a huge amount of money to take the MFA, it's like you better.
Right, absolutely, yeah.
And as you say, you also meet other people who are engaged in similar endeavors.
Exactly, as are some of the people in the acknowledgements.
Yeah, exactly so.
Yeah.
So talk about this business of needing to go through these apprenticeship novels. What did you actually have to learn by writing those novels?
Well, I had to learn how to write. I had to learn...
But what does that mean?
Okay, I had to learn pacing. I had to learn... For me, personally, I think one of the things that's a great joy is being able to transition well from scene to scene and just feel this great satisfaction in the way that it is moving, instead of just a sort of... I don't know. For example, a page of dialogue with absolutely no attribution and no descriptions and no world being formed around this conversation. Just, things like that you have to learn how to do by doing. Yeah.
And again, to return one of your questions.
Yeah.
So would you then take a page, a chapter, to one of your writing groups and read it? Or were you not part of the writing group?
No, I wasn't part of that.
Okay.
No, that was the wall that came after the MFA.
I see. Okay. So let's talk about that business of you couldn't get them published. 2 of them you thought were actually pretty good.
Yes.
Why do you think, and this is for the viewers who still think that there is a publisher out there for any work of any quality.
Yeah.
Why do you think you couldn't find a publisher for either of those 2?
I think in my own personal situation, my books sort of lived between the place of literary and commercial, and they were not in a specific niche that was easy to sell. And so I got that feedback that perhaps I had to decide what I was writing and pick a niche, pick a market, which isn't always so easy to do because I'm not thinking about marketing when I'm writing a novel.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of the things that I talk to the students in the publishing class about is that the kind of feedback that you often get from an editor at a publishing house, it sounds as if they're saying you're not a good writer. what they're really saying is we don't think we can make enough money on this book to pay the overhead on 2 floors of the Flatiron Building, in New York, which is really what it boils down to.
Yeah.
Interesting. So tell us about the genesis of Shape of the Sky.
Okay. And before I do that,
Yeah.
I just don't want to lose the opportunity to say that the cover is by the Vermont artist Darryl Storrs, and I love her work, so I just wanted to mention that.
Storrs?
Correct.
Okay, good.
Darryl, yeah. The genesis of the book. So in 2004, Phish played their famous, was supposed to be final concert in Coventry, and I actually was not at that concert. I was out of state at the time. But in the lead up to that concert, there was an awful lot of news coverage, and I was very interested in it. And I read a lot of articles. And I remember reading an article in the Free Press about a farmer who had decided not to plant his crops this year, 2004, because he could make more money in one weekend renting his land as campground space than he would make all year if he planted crops that summer, that spring. Mm-hmm. And I thought, whoa, this town is going to go through such enormous change just for this one weekend. And I started writing about a farmer. And that's really how it started. It didn't start as being a novel. It started being a story about a farmer who had to make this decision. And then I started writing about other people in the town, and that turned into the beginnings of the novel. And then I was a little bit concerned that it was going to turn into another 10-year project, so I began to apply structure, which we could talk about, but that was the genesis.
Good luck. So yes, let's talk about applying structure, because there are several things that hold the book together and give it a sense of movement.
Yes.
So structure is something that people are not very good at thinking about. It seems abstract to most people. The relationships between things and the relationships between the relationships between things, that's pretty abstract. So I can think of at least 2 or 3 different ways in which you give this coherence. In other words, it all seems to be the same book. And also what you might call élan, movement forward. So when you started thinking of applying structure, what did you think? How did you go about doing this?
Well, originally what it was a construct to keep me focused and to make me stick to a plan. Not an outline. I wanted to do something a little more creative than just like 1, 2, 3, A, B, C.
Right.
And I play piano, and I have a wonderful piano teacher named Carol Hewitt, who teaches us every year at the beginning of the year about the circle of fifths, which is this visual representation of the interrelationship between the keys on the piano for our use. So what I decided to do was to substitute a character for each key on the circle of fifths, and then to have that character show up again in another chapter as a minor character in someone else's major chapter. That's what I was doing. So yes, each...
So maybe we can zoom in on this. So each chapter is in fact headed by the name of a character and a key signature.
Correct.
So does that mean that you were aware that there was a gathering complexity to the key signatures? Because you actually, without wishing to be... this is a musical spoiler, ladies and gentlemen, right? So we begin in the key of C. And,
with a farmer.
Right.
Who's a pretty grounded guy.
Right, and it's the simplest of all the key signatures. And there's a certain return to that.
Yes.
So were you thinking in terms of accumulating complexity as you went?
Not at first, but eventually I did swap some things around, and then I had to change which characters showed up in whose chapters, which was fun. It was so much fun.
Right.
I was really pleased to find this structure to play with.
Yes, this is what writing is about.
Exactly, yeah. And eventually, yes, I did try to complicate the lives of the characters as the key structure got more complicated. But it's nothing that the reader would necessarily know or need to know or pick up on, but it was fun for me, playing God.
And for heaven's sake, we're doing this because we want to do something we enjoy as writers. Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay, so this is kind of like, the screenwriters who put the in, like in The Simpsons, where they put the in-jokes in there that only they're going to get.
Right.
They've got to have some fun here.
Right.
Okay, so yes. So while that is taking place, there's also this implicit notion that each character has a place in this musical construct. That everybody has a place. It's a very inclusive novel. It's one where you start out with the least judgmental person as well, the person who sees a little good in everything. And one of the ways in which you go about doing this is to sort of say, in each case, each one of these, it's not like good and bad. It's a different note or a different key.
Absolutely. And the good and bad thing is important too, because there are characters that are less attractive than other characters, but I did always try to write from that person's narrative point of view, even if it wasn't a first-person point of view, to understand who that person was and give them a little context so that they weren't good or bad, which is boring.
So that's another question that I wanted to ask you, because I have a perpetually unfinished novel called Shakespeare's Sister, and it really raised for me the question of evil. Because if you think in conventional moral terms and you say, who is my villain? Where are my forces coming from? You essentially have to identify either a person or what they represent as something that you're prepared to tar with a black brush, And in reading this, I got the impression that you were thinking quite a lot about how can I avoid doing that?
Well, I almost think I was thinking more about what is the problem that is making this person's life so difficult right now. And maybe instead of a person, there actually is a person who's making a couple people's lives very difficult, but there's also poverty, and there's just lack of creative energy. The waning of creative energy is one person's problem. So, I don't know if those are, if that answers your question exactly, but I think in most cases I was trying to see what was obstructing this person's goals rather than necessarily a person obstructing goals.
Right.
Yeah.
And so one of the other ways in which an author often draws a reader into and through a novel, and I was actually talking to my students this morning about this, is to start by asking a question. And really that's what a mystery does. You start with somebody who is murdered, and then you follow it all the way through to find out who did it. And in fact, Dostoevsky uses this in the Brothers Karamazov. It's anything but a detective story really, but it's really kind of what draws you through it. And your novel starts with, I'm being very careful not to do some spoiling here, it starts with a death.
Yes, early on. Yeah.
Early on, right. And yet you clearly don't want to use that in the conventional sense as a murder mystery.
That's correct. Well, there are two things that happened. One thing that happened was I was writing a chapter, and all of a sudden the person in the chapter found a body. And I know that sounds ridiculous, and I get a little irritated when writers say that the story wrote itself, blah, blah, blah. I was not expecting to put that into that story, but I did. And I thought in the end that it was a good impulse, and I went with it. But it was never supposed to be a mystery where we, find out who done it and then go into a courtroom or anything like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Because as soon as you do that, then once again everything tends to become morally black and white, or at least you have a choice, black, white, or charcoal. It's you're sort of limiting your options as soon as you go that way, it seems to me. Right,
and also you put yourself in the position of having to tidy everything up very neatly, which actually this sort of does, but not by design.
Actually, I was going to come back to that as well, because another temptation you resist is to make people's stories end.
Mm-hmm.
There's almost nobody in this book whose story is ended at the end of the book. And that's one of the things I like most about it, in fact.
Oh, good.
And again, this sort of seems to go back to this musical theme as well. We sort of pass through these various keys. That doesn't mean everything is stopped at the end of it.
Right. Yeah, no, I don't necessarily like everything all tidily figured out and fixed.
So fish is an interesting background to this.
Oh, yeah, and I should say this is a fictional town, fictional band, fictional concert.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So at the time that you were thinking about the final Fish concert, I was writing about that for Yankee magazine.
Oh, you were?
And I did a lot of listening to Fish and looking at interviews and stuff like that. And there was a point where there's a quote from Trey, who was talking about one of the other band members, and he said, like, you know that moment where, like, you wake up and you're sort of half awake and you're thinking, shall I go back to sleep again? But you decide not to. Well, he'll write a song about that. And that is, first of all, it's so Fish, right? It's also very much like your band, because the band here has all kinds of songs very much like that. But it also has to do with something about respecting and even admiring the kind of the music of the everyday. Mm-hmm. Talk to me about that a little bit.
I think it's funny because my band in the book is not based on any particular band, but I think that they write music the way that I think I would if I wrote music, which is just sort of inspired by what would appeal to ordinary people, you know, that want to relate to songs. So maybe it's a song about a meal that you had that was a great meal, or a song about something you read about that was interesting. I have a friend who's a musician who says that music should never be about anything and should never mean anything, but that's not actually what this band does particularly. I don't know. I just went where my thoughts led me, and it was kind of fun because I don't really write music.
So one of the things that happens in the book is this transition between the small town and the small town taken over by this entirely different population.
Yes.
And for me, the book totally kicked up an entire gear with the chapter that is told from the point of view of Jeannie Lynam.
Okay.
And so she picks up a hitchhiker.
Yes.
And the hitchhiker is called Zibbet. Is that
Zibbet?
Zibbet, right? Zibbet. And I would like you to read a little bit of this because all of a sudden you introduce some very, very interesting concepts and complexities that sort of kind of give the whole thing a boost. So.
Alrighty. So let's see. Great. Trying to think what I need to set up about this. You just might want to know that Zibbet's in a bridesmaid dress because she's... Oh, no, okay, this is a short section. Okay. Look, I don't know you very well, but I can tell you're hungover and embarrassed about your situation, Jeannie said. I would be, and I get that. But you don't need to take it out on me. I'm the one who pulled my car over, remember? Let me guess, Zibbet said. Psych major, University of Vermont. You're taking a semester off, but you plan to go back in the fall. Jeannie sat back, surprised. She half wondered if Zibbet had looked through her things at some point, but it wasn't possible. She'd never left Zibbet with her backpack or her wallet, and wasn't even sure her life story existed in either of them anyway. Am I right? Dartmouth, Jeannie said. That's really weird, though. Huh, Zibbet said. She let her eyes travel up Jeannie's face, then back down again, studying her. Leaving school wasn't your idea. Something happened. Also, I think your trip has to do with something other than just following a band. Like what? I'm not sure yet, Zibbet said. She stared at Jeannie with unabashed intensity. There's desperation coming off of you, like a smell. I'm thinking probably a guy, not a nice guy. Jeannie swallowed against unexpected tears. Who was this girl? When she could speak, her words came out in a whisper. Where the hell are you getting all this?
So it seems to me that something that should be told to every writer or every writing student is that great art contains surprises. And out of the blue, you get a character who, first of all, is wearing a bridesmaid dress, right? And is also not a very nice person in certain respects at any rate.
Right.
And then secondly, she has this almost psychic ability to read people, and all of us, that changes all kinds of things going on. So where did all that come from?
You know, originally I was going to write about a girl who runs away from a rehab center, having been dropped off by her mother after a wedding, and so she's still wearing the bridesmaid's dress. But it just got too complicated, and so I had her just leave the wedding with some guy who took her in the wrong direction as a joke and dumped her off on the road and said, "You're just close to home, somebody will pick you up." I don't know exactly where it came from. Actually, I do, but it's not really relevant. But I went to a writing retreat, and it was this horrible experience. I felt so isolated, and I really just wanted to get the hell out of there. And at like 2 o'clock in the morning, in the ice and snow coming down, I like basically ran away from this writing retreat. And then I started thinking about a woman who runs away from an isolated situation that she kind of has to escape from. So that's where that came from, actually.
See, that's research.
Yes, that is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I thought that that marks a kind of transition, because one of the things that she brings to this, and in fact all of the people who are coming into town for the band bring to this, is a degree of unorthodoxy or randomness,
right.
or things not being in that kind of nice woodcut, predictable, kind of patchwork field thing.
Right, right.
And one of the things that it seems to me a novel can usefully do is introduce chaos into order.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Tell people about the title.
Okay, Shape of the Sky is the name of the actual rock festival that's going to come to the town of Resolute, Vermont. It's conceived of by the lead singer of the band. He feels like if you lie down and look up at the sky in Vermont, you can actually sort of find the shape by watching, what intersects with the sky. So yeah, that's where it comes from.
So just to take that a step further, what that implies, and now I'm really going to sound like an English teacher here now. Shoot me now. It implies that the infinite is shaped by the finite.
Okay, yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And actually, what gives a grounding and a sense of shape to the book and to these people's lives is the kind of the very small town ordinariness about what's going on. If those people hadn't decided for reasons of their own they're going to host this festival, all of these interesting things would not have happened. And certain, once again, I'm trying to avoid a spoiler here, certain reconciliations, connections, meetings would not take place.
Right, and tragedies.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I like that interpretation of how the title is working with the
Oh, you intended that, don't
No, I didn't.
So talk a little bit about, because we need to wrap up now,
yes.
about the publishing experience here. Who's publishing it, how that fits into
Thank you for asking,
the landscape of Vermont in a way.
Yes, I love that my publisher is Windridge Books of Vermont. They are a Shelburne-based publisher, and this is their first novel, which I'm so proud of, if I may say so. And it's been an absolute pleasure working with Windridge. They're a wonderful team. And I approached Lynn, and she said, "We don't publish novels, but if you send it to me, I'll have a look at it." And then it worked out. So it was an absolute thrill after 23 years of writing to have this happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
And that's perhaps a final point, really, for people who are writers. In the end, the book has to speak for itself.
Absolutely.
Whatever genre it is, it's your job to get it up to the stage where it's going to make people say, "No, yes."
Yeah, exactly. Great. Thank you for your great questions. I've really enjoyed both of these conversations.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for inviting me.
And thank you for watching Catalyst. I'm Shelagh Connor Shapiro, and this is Tim Brookes. Thanks so much.